Okay. Good evening, everyone. I'm Jacqueline Lake Sample. I'm a member of Black Dimensions in Art, Inc. in Albany, New York. And on behalf of Black Dimensions in Art and the Albany Barn, I'd like to welcome you to this virtual artist talk. Just a little bit about who we are. Black Dimensions in Art is a volunteer non-for-profit arts organization whose mission is to educate the public to the unique contributions of artists of the African diaspora within the American work scene. Also to and promote the artists in terms of exposure and sales, and also to work with our youth and encouraging them to participate in the arts, to apply the arts and to practice the arts. BDA will be celebrating its 50th anniversary in 3 years. So that's a good thing. Tonight, our host is the Albany Barn. The Albany Barn is a creative arts incubator that provides live and workspace and professional development opportunities to local artists and creatives. They partner with local community organizations to provide artistic programming at little to no cost to the participants. And they host everything from theatrical performances to concerts to business meetups in their space. The barn is housed in a former school in the heart of Arbor Hill. Currently at the barn, the exhibit that is there, it's called Messengers and Messages, The Keys. It's a visual art exhibition presented by local artist Royal Brown. It features paintings, sculptures depicting an esoteric alphabet of Brown's own creation, as well as a fleet of spaceships created using found materials. The Keys is on display at the barn through the end of March and can be viewed by making an appointment with the barn staff via info@albanybarn.org, and we'll just put that up in the chat for you. Or you can call 518-935-4858. And I have already seen the exhibit. It's really good. It's amazing what Royal has done with found objects in creating these massive and miniature spaceships. So please take some time and go see the exhibit before it ends. Tonight, we will be in conversation with author William F. Walker and illustrator Marcus Kwame Anderson. We will be discussing the book, The Black Panther Party, a graphic novel history. So at this time, I'm going to, instead of me doing the introduction of Marcus and David, I'm going to ask each of you to speak about your work prior to the Black Panther Party. Give us a little bit of that, and then we'll just jump right into our conversation if that's okay. So whoever wants to go first.
Marcus wants to go first.
All right. Hey everyone, I'm Marcus Kwame Anderson. I've been doing art pretty much all my life, and I've loved comic books for most of my life since childhood. So it was kind of natural that the two would come together. And I've been creating comics and illustrating for years, and this project, has essentially been my dream project because it kind of merged, two interests of mine: Black history and activism and comics. So yeah, that's the path that brought me here.
All right. Well, my name is David F. Walker, and I write comics and graphic novels. I write other stuff too, and I've been working professionally in the comics industry for about 10 years, but I've been doing, amateur stuff and like real underground stuff for over 20 years. And I teach part-time at Portland State University. I live on the West Coast, and this Black Panther Party book is a follow-up to a graphic novel I did on the life of Frederick Douglass that came out almost 2 years ago.
Okay, thank you, David and Marcus. So we're gonna kind of jump right into our questions because we just have an hour and there's a lot to cover. So the first question is directed to David, and we wanted to know, how did the project come about, and how did you decide that Marcus would be the ideal illustrator for this book?
Well, the project came about, I was talking to my editor at the time. The Frederick Douglass book had just come out, and we were talking about follow-ups, potential follow-ups. And I had been wanting to do a graphic novel about the life and death of Fred Hampton of the Illinois Black Panther Party. And I talked to him about that, my editor, and he felt that it was a better book would be the Panthers in general. And, I couldn't disagree with his argument. So I decided, yeah, let's do it. So from there, I had to find an artist, and the publisher gave me a short list of who they were interested in, and they asked that I provide a short list of who I was interested in. And as I was looking at artists and trying to think about who would be good for it, um, Marcus had posted some stuff. It was probably like on Instagram or Twitter. I'd been following him for quite some time. I was a fan of his work, and there was just something about it that struck me. And I remember I went to his website and I was looking at some of the art, and there was a nice eclectic mix between, what I would call fine illustration and painting, and then more comic book cartoon style. And it got in my head that this would be a really good style for the book. So I reached out to him, asked if he'd be interested, and then submitted him and some of his portfolio pieces to the editorial team. And I tried to stack the deck in his favor. So because I really I could see it. I knew that it was gonna work.
Great, that's fantastic. Well, we know of Marcus's work here in Albany, so we're happy that you chose him to do this book, and we're all enjoying it. Um, I must say, when I finished reading the book, I had lots of emotions going, going all over the place, and I found it to be really informative, and it grabs you because it makes you think about where we are, where we were, where we may not be going. So that was just my take on the book. Um, David, can you speak to us about the process of your research and writing this book, and how that process differed from writing fictional comics?
Well, I went into this foolishly thinking that I knew a lot about the Panthers, only to discover
Mm,
I didn't know that much.
mm,
So basically, one of the first things I started doing was getting visual reference together so that, I could get stuff to Marcus. And then I just started pouring through the books. I started with everything that I had in my own personal library, which were books like Bobby Seale's autobiography and some of
mm,
Huey Newton's books. And then I just started, getting everything that I could possibly find. Black Against Empire is a really good one. There was like 3 or 4 really good books, and then I just within a few weeks I had 30 or 40 books piled up, and I had
mm,
an outline of what I wanted to work on, and so I would just sort of do a dive, and it would be like, okay, today's the day I'm going to work on the free breakfast program. I'm going to figure out how that worked, the history of it, who was involved. And I would have a stack of books next to me. I would read through them. I'd start to make notes, and then I would put together essentially how that section of the book, how it would read, and then go back and forth with Marcus about some of the ideas of what we could do visually. um, in a traditional comic, there's always more action. It's not as much
mm,
about conveying information. So I didn't write this script as much like a traditional comic, which would be like, okay, Superman, saves the kids that are in the bus that's about to go off the cliff or anything like that.
mm,
Um, and and yeah, we just put it together that way. There was a lot of back and forth between us, and it early on, as Marcus was showing me some of the layouts that he was doing, I felt like, he's got it under control. So I wasn't really worried about that. It was more making sure I got my facts straight, and that it fit within, there's a limited amount of space. We had a certain number of pages. I know how much can fit into a single page, how many pages are in the book. So that's where like the mathematician came in.
mm. And you are a mathematician.
When it comes to comics, yep, I'm a
Good,
mathematician.
good,
Yeah.
good. So this, you and Marcus can speak to this. Um, can you speak about how your book and other graphic novels can be used as educational tools?
Marcus, you wanna jump into that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, ever since I was a kid, I learned a lot just from like reading, traditional comic books like X-Men. They went all over the world, so I would learn about, geography. There was like politics in those books. There were allegories for like, race relations and a lot of things. So I was learning just even from those like, funny books that people, would kind of look down upon. And then autobiographical or just biographical books like the one that David and I worked on, they just go even further in that direction. And the visual side of comics, it provides this balance. Like comics are very literary, and like the comics that I would read as a kid were very dense word wise. But the balance of the images, it didn't make it feel dense. You know what I mean? Like, so you could read a very, wordy book with like a ton of prose, but you also, I don't know, it was almost like watching a film, So I think it provides a balance, and it's just a good tool in general. And for, readers who might be hesitant, it's a good entry point, and for me, reading comics only led to me only led to me wanting to read other forms of writing.
Okay.
Yeah, I building off of that. When I was a kid growing up, there was a couple different comic series. One was called Classics Illustrated, and they would do these adaptations of like Herman Melville and Alexander Dumas and Charles Dickens. And so I was at a very early age, I was introduced to what, I guess we'd consider classic literature. I read the comic book version of Tale of Two Cities before I'd read actual Tale of Two Cities. So I was, I was sort of living proof of what comics can do in terms of educating or introducing people to new things. But I also know that, in the public school system here in the United States, the vast majority of us learn how to read the same way, which is through a juxtaposition of text and image, starting with flashcards and then moving into picture books and, Dr. Seuss and the Bernstein Bears. And then rather quickly, the pictures get removed from the books right around the time kids are maybe somewhere between the fourth and sixth grade. Suddenly books have either fewer pictures or no pictures. And that's when a lot of kids lose interest in reading, right? And it's, you would think it wouldn't be that difficult to figure out why, but no one's figured it out. But the reason is because books with pictures are just better, period. I don't care what it is, and so as I, developed my career in comics, but then also started exploring education and a love of history, I started to realize there's no reason why we can't bring all of these things together. There's no reason why we can't, I was that kid who didn't want to read anything that wasn't a comic, right? Didn't mean I didn't want to read. It just meant I wanted to read what I wanted to read. I believe that we all learn in different ways. We all are engaged intellectually in different ways. And so, rather than forcing kids to learn one specific way, we should be open to the possibilities that there's other modes of reaching them.
Yeah. And I agree with that. I think we do have to look at other ways because we all learn, the brain works in different ways for everyone. Some people are visual learners and some people can just look at text and they're good, and some people are a combination of it. And so it's best to figure that out at an early age so that we don't lose them along the way, which is what happens. We lose a lot of children along the way because of the system that we now have. So I think you're right. So we wanted to talk to you and have you talk with us about the origins of the Black Panther Party and how it fit into the broader civil rights movement. How did you see that in doing your research and writing the book?
Well, the Black Panther Party, the original first Black Panther Party started in Lowndes County, Alabama, and it was a political party that was an offshoot of SNCC. Like, I'm going to say around 64, they were there doing voter registration, and it was a lot of violence. And so this organization um, formed, and as opposed to a lot of the other uh, um, civil rights organizations, they didn't adopt a nonviolent stance.
Mm-hmm.
So they made headlines, and a lot of people were interested in what was going on in Lowndes County. And in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, Oakland specifically, was a very violent city in the 60s, a lot of police brutality. And you happen to just have this small group of activists, of Black activists, that were trying to, figure out how to stand up to the police.
Mm-hmm.
And with the Panthers that formed in Oakland, they took their name from the Panthers in Lowndes County. But
Mm-hmm.
Huey Newton, Bobby Seale, the two founding members of the party, along with the Forte brothers and Bobby Hutton, a few others that were early members to come on board. They
Mm-hmm.
were they were all kids who were born in the South, and their parents had migrated to the Bay Area during the Great Migration, which was when Black families left the South and went either north or west primarily. Um, and, and they left looking for a better way of life. And they just found a different way of life that was still very oppressive, a lot of police brutality, a lot of racism. And so, I like to think that the Black Panther Party in Oakland was sort of born out of this first generation of young men who grew up, who were born in the South, but they grew up outside of the South in a place that was supposed to be the promised land, and it
Mm.
wasn't. And
Yeah.
and then what do you do when there's nowhere else left to run? You know what I'm
Yeah.
saying? It's
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
there, unless you went up to Canada, and it's not
Yeah.
necessarily to say that Canada was going to be any better. And so
Mm-hmm.
it's in Oakland especially, there was a lot of Black folks had relocated there because of the shipyards
Mm-hmm.
during World War II. They were working in the shipyards. And what's part of the unwritten history of America is that during the Great Migration, as Black folks were moving to cities and their populations were growing, happened in Chicago, it happened in Oakland, it happened uh, in LA.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, the These cities needed to grow their police departments, and so what they did is they started recruiting cops, or people to become police officers, and they always recruited them from the South. So they were
Mm.
recruiting the people
Yeah.
who were from the same area that the Black folks were trying to escape. And so
Yes.
that whole cycle of oppression followed
Mm-hmm.
them. And I think that, maybe there's just something in the water in the Bay Area, but you just had this small group of guys that just weren't really going to take it anymore.
Mm.
And it wasn't just guys too, because within a few months of forming the party, there was, a lot of girls started joining, and it was,
Mm-hmm.
most of the members were, the average age was late teens to early 20s. At the time they
Yeah.
formed, the oldest member was Bobby Seale, and he was like maybe 26, I think, at the time. But the youngest member was 16, and that was Bobby
Mm.
Hutton.
Mm-hmm. Wow. And that really says something about a generational shift
Hmm.
in terms of what we will tolerate and what we will not tolerate.
Yep.
And that was clearly what was going on with these young people. And you're seeing some of that today as well. So, you know, you talk about how much we've had change or not had change, you know,
Yeah.
and we're still looking at that stuff. So, um, tell me, the symbol, the Black Panther, um, what is the meaning of that, of the panther? What does the panther represent?
Well, Huey Newton said this. He had been inspired by the Lowndes County Freedom Organization,
Mm-hmm.
which they had adopted the Black Panther as their symbol, as their mascot, as it were. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and Huey would say that the panther is an animal that won't attack until it's backed into a corner. So that was
Mm-hmm.
sort of his idea, was that that Black people had reached a point where they had been backed into a corner. You have to think about it. Malcolm X had just been assassinated the year before,
Mm-hmm.
and all the guys in the Panthers were very devout followers of Malcolm X, as was the case in a lot of northern and west coast cities. The more the South was still very much under the influence of the Southern poverty, not the Southern Christian.
Christian.
Yeah, there's so
Yes.
many different
There are
names,
many.
but Dr. King and his
Yeah.
organization,
Okay.
and you know, and of course, you know, Dr. King was still around, but we're talking about a time when especially young people were starting to ask, what's the point of this nonviolence? And SNCC especially was really, you know, with guys like Stokely Carmichael, who later would become Kwame Ture, you know, they were like, you know, why are we getting hit upside the head? And I think I think what happened with the Panthers, the formation of the Panthers in Oakland, it was going to happen in other cities anyway. There just happened to be this particular movement that everybody noticed, you know, down south. And but just, yeah, I think the you know, because the Black Panther is just it's a sleek looking animal. I don't know how to say it any other way, but there's just something ferocious about it. And I think that was by design, because they wanted people to know that they weren't sheep, that they weren't, you know, that they weren't going to be timid in the face of oppression.
Yeah.
Right. And there was also the idea that, you know, the Panther isn't necessarily going to go looking for trouble, but when backed into a corner, you know, the Panther is ready to fight and do what it needs to do to defend itself.
Exactly. Makes sense to me. So we are in Women's History Month. And so one of the questions we would like to have you um, talk to us about is speak to us about the role of women in the Black Panther Party. What types of roles did they have, you know?
Yeah.
And
Do you want to jump into that first, Marcus? Or?
Marcus? Yeah.
Sure. I mean, you know, the party overall, you know, there's obviously the like more known figures that people know, like Huey P. Newton, Bobby Seale, but the rank and file of the party, you know, was the heart of the party, and like, you know, at certain points, over half of the party consisted of women, and like, you know, it was like the most vital nuts and bolts bolt jobs that women were doing. And, you know, we definitely cover in the book that it's not like it was utopian and that all of the men, you know, cooperated and were enlightened, you know, but there was women, you know, 100% played a huge role in the party. Maybe didn't always get the recognition they deserved, but it wouldn't be what it was without women. And then, you know, later on, Elaine Brown would run was in charge of the organization later on. So, but yeah, you know, we definitely covered that in the book. But yeah, women were vital.
Yeah.
Well, and so the thing too is that, as Marcus was saying, there's within the rank and file there was a lot of women, and as law enforcement was, you know, really putting the squeeze on the Panthers, a lot of the men were being thrown in jail, thrown in prison, tied up in court cases, or just being outright killed. And so by the late 60s and into the early 70s, there was a lot of women who were not only having to step up in various leadership roles, but in like confrontations with the police. So you take like in LA or Chicago, where there was some pretty famous shootouts with the police, there were women there. And you know, the thing is, you know, the party was definitely sexist and had its issues with sexism. And there was definitely people that didn't respect the power of women in general. You know, one of the things that's isn't talked about that much, but it's, you know, the tail end of the party, the last 5-6 years that the party was together, it was held together primarily by women. And every time something bad happened, it was because a man tried to, well, specifically Huey or Eldridge Cleaver tried to reclaim power. And the interesting thing is, it's, you know, women in general, but Black women in particular, like Black women's history is the most poorly recorded history in this country. If we're going to
Yes.
talk about how poorly recorded Black history is in general, then we could get specifically into Black women. And it's, you know, I don't think I noticed it as much until I started not just this project, but the Frederick Douglass project, especially. And I thought it would be a
Mhm.
little bit better because, you know, oh, we're in the 20th century, you know, things have
Mhm.
changed, but, um, you know, sometimes things haven't changed as much. And that's one of the things that
Mhm.
I keep thinking about more is like, if, if I know some of the stories of some of the women throughout history and I don't know
Mhm.
nearly enough, how bad is it
Mhm.
for everybody else, right?
Exactly.
How many people are
Exactly.
less informed?
Yes. And so I see another book coming.
Yeah, yeah, there needs to be more, lots more. Yeah.
There needs to be more. But this phenomenon of Black women being involved and holding down the reins, I mean, throughout history, as well as all of the organizations, including the churches. I
Mhm.
mean, predominantly it's the Black woman that holds it down. So yeah, that is
Well,
definitely something.
one of the things I have to interject this because I feel like one of the reasons that as just as a society that we don't that women don't get talked about the way they should is because n- nobody likes to admit the things that they've done wrong, right? And nobody's
Yeah,
been wronged
true.
more in this country than
Hmm.
Black women, we could say that.
Hmm. True.
And so to acknowledge that,
Hmm.
it's just like, you know, when white folks don't want to acknowledge racism,
Hmm.
it's they can say, well, I'm not a racist, or my family isn't. I as a man can say, well, I'm not a sexist, but it doesn't mean I haven't, you know, I haven't enjoyed the perks of being a man. And once you begin to understand that and see it, then it's harder to turn away, and then you begin to have to acknowledge stuff. And you know, every day something happens where I have to like face my privilege as a man, right? Because we
Yes.
all have privilege over
Yes.
somebody.
Hmm.
Um, and you know, so now as I get older, I'm thinking about, okay, how can we? It's not just about undoing the oppression of blackness that
Hmm.
has happened in this country. It's also the oppression of women in this country.
Yes. Yes.
There's a long list.
Yes. Well, thank you for that, and I'll be looking forward to the book um, when it comes out. um, so we're gonna kind of switch it up a little bit. Um, Speaking to Marcus and you also, David. But first, I'm gonna go to Marcus. I want Marcus. Can you speak to us about your artistic process and what the challenges were in illustrating the book? And one of the things that I noticed as I was reading the book is the life that's in those pieces, you know, and how you do that with shading and coloring and stuff. So can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, definitely. So, when it came to my visual approach for the book, like as David mentioned, we spoke quite a bit, like leading into the book, you know, just about the approach. There's, you know, there are definitely chapters in the book that have a more, you know, traditional sequential comic book approach, you know,
Hmm.
with just panel to panel action and dialogue. But because we're also dealing with so much history, um, you know, there's quite a bit of it where, you know, we would be dealing with narration, and then I had to, each of the panel with the narration would have a corresponding image that tried to speak to, you know, whatever we were narrating at the moment, whether it was an uprising or Huey being in prison and communicating with other Panthers. So I basically, you know, there in David's writing, there would be like quite a few like cues, you know, or ideas that he had
Hmm.
had going in, you know, and then there was, you know, also a lot where he trusted, you know, me to, you know, handle a situation, however I saw it visually, you know. But the and the other thing that really helped is, like, you know, having worked with different writers, you know, the writing of this script was very lent itself very easily to being illustrated. There's certain times where writers, you know, especially if they're used to dealing with prose, they don't they'll write something and it'll be almost like, all right, well, we need to see from over the shoulder but we also need to be able to see the person's expression. You know what I mean? Like they'll give you contradictory contradictory cues, and you as an artist are like, well, all right, how am I going to show all these things all at once? You know, but I didn't really run into that with this book. So yeah, like we just had an open line of communication. You mentioned color and shadow, and
that was a lot.
yeah, that was something that I took heavily into consideration. And so for instance, you'll notice that there's color shifts at times. Like overall, I went with a kind of muted blue and orange themed color scheme. And I mean, that's for two reasons. Partially because I wanted something that felt like it was it was somewhat older, like, you know what I mean, like maybe aged film,
and it gave it that feel. Yeah,
right, yeah. And also it's just orange and blue is my favorite complementary color you know, combination. So so that was kind of the standard color palette for the book. But then as I would shift into chapters of violence, and like particularly like racially motivated violence, I would switch the color scheme to a more harsh red themed, you know, color palette. And like that was very intentional. And you see it definitely in the chapter about Fred Hampton's assassination.
yeah.
And so yeah, like I thought a lot about color and how it could evoke, you know, like feelings and kind of like set mood throughout the book as I illustrated it.
And it did. It did.
Yeah. And
David?
actually some of the sorry.
No,
I was gonna say like some of the challenges were that, you know, you're dealing, so there's a lot of iconic photos of people. And you know, that helped when it came to some of the portraits of some of the more famous people. But for so many of the scenes that I'm illustrating in the book, there wasn't really photographic evidence. Like, you know, like if someone is doing a book 30 years from now about the Black Lives Matter movement, there's going to be far more you know, photographic reference, because everybody's got a camera at all times. But you know, back then cameras weren't as ubiquitous, and so, you know, there was a lot of cross-referencing, you know what I mean? So I had to do a lot of sketches of Huey, do a lot of sketches of Bobby, Elaine Brown, the people who would recur throughout the book, just to kind of like familiarize myself and get that muscle memory for drawing them, so I could draw them in different scenarios. And then there's also the balance of kind of cartoonifying them, you know what I mean, like turning them into comic book characters without losing their likeness. So I mean, it just was a lot of sketching, and I actually have quite a bit of just conceptual art that isn't in the book, just from figuring out how it was all going to work.
Well, we have to have an exhibit of that.
That's for the deluxe edition of the book.
Yeah, okay.
The 25th anniversary.
Yeah.
25th anniversary, that sounds good. So David and Marcus, I have this thing that I always think about in terms of the marriage of the word and art. And in this instance, it's the marriage of the word and art in revolution. Can you guys speak to that, please?
Well, you know, one of the things with the Panthers is that they utilized art, recognized art as both a way of reaching the people and as a form of propaganda. And so like the visual component of the Panthers was so important to them, from how they dressed to the look of the newspaper to the design of it. They understood reaching the people. And some of this actually, you know, goes back to like when I was doing my research on Frederick Douglass, which was, you know, Frederick Douglass was the most photographed American of the 19th century. And he understood the importance of the visual, right? And honestly, I've never read anything that talks about this. This is just an assumption that I've come up with, and I'm sure there's like someone's written a whole, you know, master's thesis on it. But you know, I think that especially for Black folks in America who were denied the right to learn how to read and to become educated, I think within us, there's the visual component was a lot stronger for a lot longer. We had to learn how to communicate ideas visually. We also did it through song and things like that. But to me, there's, that revolutionary idea of spreading ideas and information in ways you're not supposed to do it is about as revolutionary as it gets,
As it gets, yes.
and so the Panthers were, I mean, the most revolutionary thing they did was they fed poor Black kids, right?
Exactly.
They fed
Yes.
them, and then while they were feeding their bodies, they fed their
In their
minds.
minds, yes.
And when you see a picture of, the free breakfast program in action, it's like that picture, the only way it could be say more is if you were in the room watching it happen, because a picture does speak louder than words.
Yes.
And especially when that picture is evoking both an emotional and an intellectual response. You see it, you feel it in your heart and your soul, but then you start thinking about what you're seeing. And and to me, that's the beauty of it. And with Marcus's work, you know like, people don't even have to read the book. They can just look at the pictures and go,
Yeah.
something important happened here, right?
Yeah.
If they want the
Yes. Yes.
specifics of what happened, then they can read my words. But my words are, in a lot of ways, I always feel like the words in a comic or a graphic novel, I will never say that they're not important, but they are secondary to the visuals. We are drawn into the visuals. It's the pictures that make us want to read whatever is corresponding with it.
Yeah. And yeah, that's true. Yes. The visual definitely takes you to a different level, on a different trip, as you'd say. So Marcus, how about you?
I mean, yeah, absolutely everything that David said. I think that it has continued, and I mean, I think we'll get into later how the events that we cover in the book, how they, lead into today's activism. But if you look throughout history, like, revolutionary movements, that visual component, it moves people, and there's something internal. So I mean, it was the same here. And yeah, I think that it's like inextricably linked, and Emory Douglas, who
Yes.
was the main designer and illustrator on the Panthers newspaper, like, he was a brilliant artist, and he would take the iconography straight from the language that was used. You know what I mean? So the idea of, abusive cops being pigs, like, he would have cartoon images where it was like literally pigs like oppressing people, but like however somebody feels about that, like, it creates a strong image,
Yeah.
and it takes the real life violence that police were visiting upon the community, and it boils it down into something, what I mean, that, like, people take away immediately, and
Yeah.
um it just communicates a lot with a simple image.
Yeah. So the other, it was Emery Douglas and Tarika
Jerika Lewis. Yeah.
Lewis as well. She was a young lady. And how old was she again? I forget.
She was
16?
16 when
Yeah, she was a
16.
teenager when she
She was
started. Yeah.
16. She was a teenager.
Yeah. And she still does art, I believe, to this day. I know
Really?
when I was researching for the book, I came
Mm.
across some things about exhibitions that were happening in like the 20 teens. So
Okay, nice. Okay. So the other, and I'm going to ignore that because if I get up, I'm disturbing this. So, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Um, David, and Marcus as well, because I think it's a conversation that can be had by both. Um, Talk to us a little bit about the 10-point program.
Okay. Well,
Yes.
when Bobby and Huey were first putting together an organization, they wanted some guiding principles, a mantra or a manifesto. So they
Mm-hmm.
came up with the 10-point program, which is divided into two sections. There's what we want and there's what we believe, and
Mm-hmm.
they both go hand in hand. And it was really just a call a declaration of this is what we need within the community. And it was, the list was very reasonable, I think.
Yes,
They
it
wanted
was.
an end to police brutality. They wanted
Mm-hmm.
fair housing, fair employment. And, with the exception of, and Marcus is pulling it up right here, with the exception of, exemption from the draft, which I think is like around number, it's number 8. No, that's
Mm-hmm.
the federal prisons. I'll say 9 out of
7.
the.
Let me
Okay,
see.
yeah,
Oh, 6. 6.
number 6. Yep.
Yes.
And they were
Yeah.
speaking about that, the exemption from military as in forced military service, because keep in mind that this was during the Vietnam War, and the draft was all men of an age had to register for the draft, and Black men were disproportionately going off to the war.
Yes.
So but when you look at all 10 of these things of what they wanted and what the demands they were making, every single one of those is still relevant today. Every
Mm-hmm.
single one. It's
Everyone.
and it's not
Mm-hmm.
like we're, this is 50 some odd years ago. They drafted this in 66. So that was
Yeah.
55 years ago, something like that.
55, almost 60. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And, but it's right here. We want decent housing fit for shelter of human beings. Right.
Yeah.
And what they're talking about, we want an end to the robbery by the white man of our Black community, which is, addressing issues of capitalism, but it's
Mm-hmm.
also addressing the disparity in the ownership of how capitalism works.
Mm-hmm.
We talk about, one of my grandfather was a huge civil rights advocate, and he marched in Washington, and but he always would tell me, he said, when I was a kid growing up and we couldn't go places, we actually had more things, and he was talking about the price of desegregation, which was, that price of assimilation. It's interesting because my
Mm-hmm.
grandfather was clearly a cat who became militant in his older years.
Yeah.
I always wondered what he was like when I was, when he was in his 20s or 30s, because I didn't come
Mm-hmm.
along till he was in his 60s or so.
Oh.
But he was, I imagine he would not have been a pro Panther person at the time, but
Mm-hmm.
when I'm talking to him and and I was in my 20s and he was in his 70s or 80s, he was a pretty militant cat, and he was always talking about, he would just talk about the things that were given up,
Mm.
in place of, desegregation and assimilation. And I think
Yes.
that that's
Yes.
really what the Panthers were talking about
Mm-hmm.
with number 3. And
Yes.
we still see it everywhere all over. I mean, I know that,
Mm-hmm.
y'all are in Albany,
Mm-hmm.
and I've seen, I've got family all over Albany and Schenectady and Rensselaer and Del Mar, and I, like I've been to the poor parts of,
Exactly.
I've been to the
Yes.
ghetto in Schenectady, and
Mm-hmm.
it is like that's scarier than the ghetto in Bridgeport, Connecticut, which is saying a
Mm.
lot.
Mm.
And it's like, whenever I'm there hanging out with my cousins, I'm like, yo, like this is like the scariest place I've ever been. I haven't been to
Yeah.
Schenectady in years,
Yeah.
but that oppression is, and this is going back to my childhood. So I'm talking about Schenectady in the 70s and 80s, and
Mm-hmm.
watching it, that parts of that city just crumble
Mm.
and fall apart
Mm.
as, as
Yes.
GE started leaving. And the thing is like, I know
Mm-hmm.
if I were to go there today, I would still be able to find some of those really rundown neighborhoods, the boarded up houses. And I can't imagine that life is any better there
Mm-hmm.
now, really, than it was 40 or 50 years ago.
Wow. Yes, true. So we're coming up on the fifth. I've just got the flag that we're coming up on the 15-minute. So from the audience, would you want to ask questions, or would you want to continue on with David and Marcus just telling us about some of the other things that we have on the list to ask them about? Can I see a show of hands or hear some voices or something? I'm not hearing anything. You can turn off your mute and let me know, somebody.
You're doing fine.
Questions, please.
There's a question in the chat.
A
Yes,
question in the chat?
June
Okay.
has a question.
Okay, where
Okay.
is the question?
It says, how do you
Oh.
how do you feel the prevalence of cameras and so many images publicly available might affect illustrations and graphic novels in the future?
In
Okay.
the future.
Yes.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, I think I was definitely alluding to that in the future, there's going to be like so much more, reference for artists to draw from. And there will be, I think a little bit less filling in the blanks, which is what, the balancing act that I was talking about here is just, I had to stay true to the time period and, the, architecture, dress, vehicles of the day, and try not to have it be anachronistic. But there's a lot of times where early on in the process of this book, I was doing a chapter about which took place outside of the Panthers' first headquarters on Grove Street in Oakland, and I remember I was kind of driving myself crazy looking for images of the neighborhood. And David gave me a very valuable piece of advice, which is basically like, if we go too crazy, trying to be true to every visual aspect of everything, the book will never get done. And that was very freeing because it allowed me to still stay within the confines of the time period, but also just be a storyteller, you know what I mean, and tell the story visually. But anyway, to answer your question though, I do think that it will be a lot easier in the future to tell historical stories. I hope that answered your question. That's how I understood it.
Okay.
Well, I'll address that too, because I think, we live in an age of, sort of the amateur journalism, I guess, or photojournalism. Everybody's taking pictures and recording stuff, which I think is great. But I also think that that people need to, as people are taking these pictures, they need to help people understand what they're seeing, right? They need to contextualize stuff.
Context, yeah.
And that's the job of, I mean, a true journalism, which is something that we've really strayed far from over the last, say, 15, 20 years with, between the Fox News and all that sort of stuff. True journalism is supposed to contextualize what's going on and tell us with as little editorial input as possible. Now, we know that that's not true. It's been there since the beginning, but it's as this country becomes more divided and more partisan and more tribal, we see that, people are using images to tell a story as they want to tell it, as opposed to how it really is. And so it's, it's fascinating, because when we look at January 6th and we look at all the violence at the Capitol, we look at how those images were presented to us, and then some of the commentary that went with it. And it was, we were seeing images that were far more violent than what we've seen at some of the Black Lives Matter movement. But then the commentary that was going with the Black Lives Matter movement was not nearly as kind, I'll say. And so I think that the thing is it's, as much as I think images are crucial, there's also ideas and words that we couple them with that can make all the difference in the world. And that's the thing, if everyone's running around the camera, that's great, but you also need to people need to explain what they're showing. That's just my feeling.
Okay. Any other questions?
More questions in the chat.
Okay.
Let's see.
So
This is Jordan's one. Man, this is a long question, man.
Jordan,
my question is, with stuff like Judas and the Black Messiah, a good piece of serendipity, what do you both think of how the Panthers are viewed today? And do you think their legacy will have a wider reach today due to things like your book and Judas and the Black Messiah? Yes, I do. I've talked about this quite a bit. I'm old enough to remember when not that many people knew who Malcolm X was. Malcolm X had almost been forgotten by history, and it was a combination of like hip hop artists in the early to mid 80s talking about him, and those of us who had gotten our copies of the autobiography of Malcolm X sort of passing it around. And then when Spike Lee made his movie, suddenly people remembered who Malcolm X was. And it's interesting how quickly we can forget history. And I think that
Mhm.
the fact that there's a movie about Fred Hampton and that the actor who played Fred Hampton has been nominated for an Oscar
Mm.
means that people know who Fred Hampton is. 3 months ago, nobody knew who Fred Hampton was. Like, and I mean, obviously there were some people, but if you sat down in a room with 10 people and if all 10 of them knew who Fred Hampton was, you were sitting down with some enlightened, militant black folks. It's plain and simple as that. And so
Mhm.
I think that we're at a time, especially because there's so many parallels. You know, last summer of 2020 has a lot of parallels with the long hot summer of 67. And I
Mhm.
think that as people are trying to understand what's going on in this country, they're going to look to the Panthers as both examples of things that were done right, things that were done wrong, and the lengths to which the establishment, status quo, law and order, big business,
Mhm.
the lengths they'll go to keep their power. And if anybody underestimates it, all you have to do is look at, again, Fred Hampton was only 21 when he was murdered by the police. Bobby Hutton was only 17 when he was murdered by the police. Those are children as far as I'm concerned, and they will not hesitate to kill our children. They'll kill us too
Mhm.
as the parents, but they're willing to kill the children if it means maintaining law and order.
Yeah. Any other
Um,
questions?
There was another
yeah.
question from Trent Graham right above that one.
Mhm.
Yep. Yeah. Trent asked, are there themes that you did not include that you wished that you would have added? Hmm. I
No, I mean, go
yeah.
on.
No, you. Well, I was going to say, I'm really thinking about it. I I don't. I think that I mean, obviously, if you had a longer page count,
Yeah,
I guess I could always imagine more. But I think that when I think about the breadth of what we covered, even starting with just giving context to, American history and civil rights and oppression prior to the Panthers and like the conditions that necessitated them. Um, no, I think we, as far as I'm concerned, I think we covered everything that I could imagine at this moment. Probably if
yeah.
you ask me next year, I'll think of something.
I,
But
I would have liked to have had um, uh, more on women in the party, most
right,
definitely. Um, and there was stuff that got left out, but a lot of it was just keeping in mind, say, the the age group that we were trying to reach, and there was some stuff where it was like um, there were members of the party that did some really bad things, and I just felt like this isn't that book. I don't need to talk about who did, the worst things. Yes, Revolutionary Women book
yes,
two
Six,
would
six
be
book two. Yes.
that would be it. And as far as getting the book into schools and communities, that's a great question. A lot of schools are already using it. I mean,
yeah,
I've gotten a ton of feedback in the 2 months that it's been out. One of the best things is just if teachers or librarians is to reach out to them and say, hey,
yes, yep,
this, like, because librarians are they're the greatest people in the world.
yeah,
um, Teachers are good too, they're okay, but librarians just seem to know a little bit more about a lot of things. So I'm always just telling people, yeah, just talk to, if you've got kids in school, talk to the teachers. And I'm hoping that at some point, maybe putting together some sort of lesson plan that I could put
Oh,
online
nice.
that teachers could then use, and like
Yeah.
discussion jump off points.
Mm, that would be great. Yes. Mm.
Although one of you could do it too,
yeah,
it's
yeah,
there's
absolutely.
We do have some teachers in the audience or retired teachers. Yes. I see one already right there. I think I'll talk to her about it. Um, are there any further questions?
Yeah, this is Deborah. I have a question of I really in terms of the book and getting it into schools. The 10 points that you pointed out, as you said, are so very relevant right now
Mhm.
that somehow we need to get into either community centers and have people reflect to see how has this changed? Because this is about really investing Black, educating Black. We need to understand our history. And so I'm really pushing. I mean, it just seems wonderful. I'm so happy I'm on this call. But I really feel like those 10 points could be pulled out and really addressed um, across NAACP. All of these organizations should be able to look at what you've done to say, how has this changed? Because if we're really talking about intentional change, you know, that transformation, intention creates prosperity. Intention means that we're transforming. And we can talk about the history, but if we're not really focusing on how do we begin to change the narrative, I think that what you've done, and children love comics, you know, I mean, they love them
Yeah.
and they can relate to it. And they could be the superheroes in this comic book. So I'm just saying we need to really work on that.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I agree
Absolutely.
100%.
Yes.
Yeah.
Definitely. Any further questions? Any other questions? Comments? I have to let you know the book is in its second reprint. So if you haven't gotten yours yet, please go out to the, we have the book house at Stuyvesant Plaza. We also have Barnes and Nobles here. And Marcus, can you put up that link to purchase for the book
sure.
in the chat, please?
Yep.
So that people can go to that as well. But I would recommend getting this book and giving it to young people, because that's what I'm going to be doing. I'm giving it, I have a list that I'm going to be giving the book to, and adults too. So yes, I would recommend definitely getting the book, reading it. It's heart-wrenching. Yes, it is. Yes. So Marcus, oh, Clifford, you have a question?
I just want to make a comment. I've said this before, Marcus, I don't mean to embarrass you, but you are my superhero.
Thank you, Cliff. I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
I'm with you, Cliff. I agree. It's I'll say this as a parting thought. Working with Marcus on this book, it has been really one of the best projects of my career and my life. And when I look at it, you know, I don't like anything that I've worked on. I'm one of those creators who looks at it and just, but this thing, I look at it and I'm just like, it's so beautiful and it's so relevant. And you know, I'm looking forward to working with Marcus again and seeing what kind of trouble we can get into.
And we're going to look forward to it also. So it is 8 o'clock. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Please go out and get the book and read it and share it. There's a lot of important information, and there are things that we can begin to do in the community, particularly with our young people. So Marcus and David, thank you so much for doing this with us.
Thank you,
Good
Jack.
night, everybody.
Take care.